You're on mute, Nicole.
Thanks. I'd like to welcome you all to the Department of Political Science Colloquium series. My name is Nicole Grove, and I'm an associate professor in the department, and I'm organizing our colloquia this semester. We're very honored to have with us today Professor Heoli Osorio, who will be speaking about their new book, Remembering Our Intimacies, Mo'olelo, Aloha Aina, and Ea. Jamaica Heoli Mele Kalani Osorio's research, teaching, and activism centers on decolonization in Hawaii and beyond, bringing together and reproducing personal, genealogical, and scholarly relations between Hawaii and Oceania. Dr. Osorio's book, Remembering Our Intimacies, centers on the personal and embodied articulations of Aloha Aina to detangle it from the effects of colonialism and occupation. Working at the intersections of Hawaiian knowledge, Indigenous queer theory, and Indigenous feminisms, it seeks to recuperate Native Hawaiian concepts and ethics around relationality, desire, and belonging grounded in the land, memory, and the body of Native Hawaii. We're also extremely pleased to be joined today by Professors Noenoe Silva and Jonathan Golderg-Hiller in the Department of Political Science, and Professor Kawika Tengan in the Departments of Anthropology and Ethnic Studies. Professor Silva's work centers on recovering Kanaka Maoli history and literature through reading underused texts in Hawaiian from the 19th and early 20th centuries, and in developing theory from within Hawaiian epistemologies and worldviews. She is the author of Aloha Betrayed, Native Hawaiian Resistance to American Colonialism, and the Power of the Steel-Tipped Pen, Reconstructing Native Hawaiian Intellectual History, both published by Duke University Press. Professor Golderg-Hiller's research emphasis is on public law, comparative politics, and Marxist theory, and considers how changing forms of identity, nationalism, political authority, and political economy have modulated the mobilization of rights in various contexts, and how rights are resisted and how they retain relevancy. Professor Tengan is chair of the Department of Ethnic Studies and cross-appointed in the Department of Anthropology. His research and teaching span Hawaiian masculinities, sovereignty, land, militarism, identity, museums, heritage, football, Native Pacific culture and politics, and the experience of Native Hawaiian veterans. Committed to Hawaiian rights, he's also served as a cultural expert on cases dealing with water rights on Maui, burial site protection on Oahu and Hawaii, and the protection of religious freedoms of Hawaiian prisoners on Oahu and in Arizona. So we're really pleased to have you all here. In terms of the structure of the colloquium today, we'll hear from Professor Osorio about Remembering Our Intimacies for about 15 minutes, and then we'll hear reflections on the book from our guests for about 10 minutes each. Heoli will respond, and then we'll move on to open discussion and questions from the audience. So to ask a question or share a comment, I'll ask that you use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and then those questions will be moderated to our guests today. Transcription is being enabled right now, and the colloquium is being recorded, so it will be available online shortly after the talk. And with that, I'll thank you again all for being here, and welcome Heoli.
Aloha mai kako. Thank you, Nicole, for that wonderful introduction and for organizing and hosting our conversation today. I'm super excited to be here. My only regret is that we are not able to do this in person because I miss all of you so much, but it's really exciting to be able to celebrate this book with some of my heroes on this panel. So I just want to begin actually with a few mahalo, a few acknowledgements. It's important to me that folks understand that this book was, in the truest sense of the phrase, a collective effort. There are so many people who touched this work and inspired this work that it would be absolutely impossible for me to name them all. But I do want to acknowledge two of my mentors, Craig Howes and Kumu Noenoe Silva, for the indispensable, unreasonable amount of work they put into this text and that they invested into me. I often tell people that I think Noenoe is probably the only person who's read this manuscript more than I have, and she may have read it like twice as many times as I have. I'm not sure. She's really, Noenoe, this wouldn't have happened without you, and I'm just really, really grateful. from the bottom of my heart, mahalo for helping me to tell this story. But this mo'olelo also is only possible because of the other kumu who preceded me in this university, people like Lili'Kalaka Me'elehiwa, who was the first professor. She wasn't even my professor, to direct me to the mo'olelo of Hi'iaka, Kumule Ku'uloho Ho'omanawanui, who had done you know, literary studies of Hi'iaka before and showed me that this is something we could do in the academy and that there would be value found in that, not just from ourselves, but from our colleagues and in our profession. Kumu like Kahikina de Silva, who helped me read these texts for the first time and interpret these mo'olelo for the first time. And of course, you know, kumu like Auntie Haunani Trask, Teresia Teaiwa, Kanalu Young, Maxine Kahulelio, Auntie Loretta, and Uncle Walter Riddy, Auntie Terry Kiko'olani, Charles Lawrence, Mari Matsuda, and Noelani Goodyear Ka'opua, along with Tai Tengan and Jonathan Golderg-Hiller, all have produced work that inspired this and have had conversations with me that supported the continued work. As many of you know, publishing anything takes some kind of endurance and certainly a special kind of support of our community. And I just feel really, really indebted to you all. And of course, to all my kaikua ana and my hoa from my time at the English department or before, or from my time on the Mauna, thank you for your contributions to this work. It is strange to have given a few of these talks in the last couple of weeks and to still feel like I'm not exactly sure what a book talk is. So I'm just gonna, and I've tried it in each moment in case there are people who are tuning in for the second time to focus on something a little different in each conversation. But first, I think I should give a little bit of an overview and a summary of what's happening in this text. This is a book that begins with the mo'olelo of Hi'iaka i Kapoli'opele as a launching point to talk about intimacy and to celebrate intimacy. And because of that, we begin with Aloha Aina and looking deeply into Aloha Aina across space and time and how our ideas around what that phrase means and our ideas on how we practice that has shifted and been influenced, not just by the great leaders and warriors of our history, but also by colonialism and how to make sense of that influence and transformation. But what I really try to do is narrow into a particular archive to discuss what it is we might take from Aloha Aina to today in a way that will help us build a future that is worthy of our kupuna and worthy of our mo'opuna. And I'm hoping, all of this is a hope, that this book is entering into conversation in Indigenous studies and politics and Indigenous feminist and queer theory and translation theory and Hawaiian studies and mo'olelo and Hawaiian language scholarship, because what I wanted was it to be a gathering of minds and stories. The dream was that this book would inspire my folks of my generation to write similar texts from their own perspective, and we could really sit around this circle and share the mo'olelo that have shaped our people so that we may shape our future more impactfully, I suppose. The crux of the story is a different reading of Aloha Aina than many of us might be familiar with or even comfortable with, and making connections between the removal of our people from our Aina and the removal of our people from each other. That our displacement, both of those displacements, have worked hand in hand in tandem. This has been a really successful settler colonial occupation project to really displace us from each other and to alienate us from each other. And this is probably something that has become even more obvious in the time of COVID. And I really wanted to dig into how our complex web of relations were completely remade and reduced. And one of those examples being through the nuclear family, but also even just the way that we engage in governance and nation building, how those things were going to be connected. And the hope was to build upon the work of my kumu, like Noenoe Silva, like Lili'Kalaka, like my father, like Haunani, who wrote texts that very clearly outlined and demonstrated, I think, the violence of colonialism, and some of the devastation of colonialism. And what I really wanted to do was to allow their work to speak for itself and to get to just talk and celebrate abundance. You know, if Kumulili Kala's text talks about all that was taken away via capitalism, then and what we're left with now, I really wanted to talk about what was here before, and what are some of the other ways we can talk about the before time into the after time. So that's, you know, that's much of the book is a critical study of Hi'iaka i Kapolio Pele, looking at different relationships from Aikane to Kane, Wahine, to Kaikua Ana, Kaikaina, Makua, Kupuna, Po'olua, Kaikoeke, Ali'i, Maka'ainana, Kama'aina, Malihini, and really centering the fact that these are relationships. None of these speak to a particular sexuality. These are really not identities in the way that we've been taught to think about identities, and how focusing on relationships and focusing on the practice of reciprocity and kuleana in these relationships would expand our worlds both horizontally, and as I'm learning from some of my students in my graduate class, vertically as well, right? There's a different kind of pilina being formed throughout generations when we take seriously even just the intimate relations we are practicing in the Wau Kanaka, in the realm of the people. The funnest chapter to write, in case you're wondering, was chapter 4, where we talk about how all aloha and pleasure goes through the aina. To me, this is the chapter that will probably make the most people uncomfortable, which makes it the most fun to talk about how sexuality and desire and pleasure is something we learn from Aina. And in all the ways we need to return to an intimate relationship with Aina, we also need to be open to letting that Aina teach us how to be in intimate relations with each other and how to build ethical and consensual relationships between each other. Then the book takes a turn from the archive into the present, with an attempt to kind of suggest how the expansiveness of these pilina and intimacies, how we could kind of see the way they're being continually disrupted by settler colonialism. So chapter 5 is really about what it means to be a kama'aina, and what it means to live in a state that is constantly appropriating our language, to continue to sell our place as product, and how a return to these stories is further resistance to that violence, and also a return to these places is further resistance to that. I should say, when I wrote the manuscript, I thought the book was done after this chapter, and much to my surprise, many of us were called to the Mauna in the summer of 2019. And you know, of course, we all went to the Mauna to protect the Mauna, but there was other ha'awina to be done there as well. And I think that experience transformed all of us and the work that we do, and changed the way we thought about almost everything. And so, of course, the book, the manuscript changed a lot after that. A whole new chapter was born and written while I lived in a leaky tent across the street from the Alahulu Kupuna, surrounded by women I barely knew but was destined to love. And you know, ultimately, what I hope is that the last chapter, and even the whole book, is really saying that it's our mo'olelo and our aloha for each other that will provide us with everything we need to be victorious. And that's not meant to be just this mushy thing, we just need to like each other better, but no, we need to take more seriously what aloha means, and how that is the work that is going to affect how we build our nation. That is the work of how we are going to decolonize and live in more ethical futures. Yeah, so I think I'll end there. I want to do a quick reading before I run out of time, because I promised I would do a reading. And because I've read almost everything else and all the other book talks in the last couple of weeks, I'm actually going to read from the end of the text. Hopefully this makes people happy. But the other thing the book tries to do is kind of push back on the expectations of what an academic text is meant to look like and feel like and read like. And so I tried at every opportunity to write in a way that was authentic to me, which meant to write creatively and to write from the No'o. And so many of the chapters begin with these shorter more lyrical, creative nonfiction essays. And this is one of those essays that opens the last chapter, and it is called Rise Like a Mighty Wave. On July 17th, 2019, I watched alongside my lahui as 38 of our beloved kupuna stood fiercely in their aloha for our aina and were hauled away by state and Hawaii County enforcement officers. Hundreds of thousands of people clung to their Facebook and Instagram live feeds, while nearly 1,000 kia'i lined the Alahuru kupuna and flooded the pahoehoe in our tears. Just 2 days earlier, on July 15th, the kia'i at the Pu'uhonua o Pu'uhuluhulu had reactivated a call to our lahui to join us in the protection of our sacred mauna. When 8 kia'i chained ourselves to the cattle guard on the access road, preventing the delivery of construction equipment, we laid there in the malu in protection of our mauna and our lahui for 12 hours. The next morning, our numbers increased from a couple hundred to 1,000 brave kia'i ready to stand up and put their bodies between our mauna and any acts of desecration. We stood proud, basking in the wealth and brilliance of our people. We also stood anxious because as our numbers grew, so did the numbers of enforcement officers and their weaponry and machinery. As we grew to possibly the greatest activation of our people since the Ku'e petition drive in 1897, we wondered if we would be met with a force that we, contemporary Kanaka, had never before encountered. In the wake of our rising wave, the state assembled its army of enforcement officers pulling from at least 6 separate agencies. And while these officers collected their weapons, our kumu, masters of ceremony, held us in the kahea of our akua. At this time, the state revealed that in the face of all our mana and abundance, it only had force and violence to offer us. When July 17th, 2019 arrived, our lahui was prepared. As police took our kupuna one by one, each empty seat was quickly filled by another kupuna ready to take a stand until no elders remained. The rest of us, their mo'opuna, gave the officers only our silence. Not even the satisfaction of our wailing grief would surround them. And as our silence grew, so did our mana. When the final kupuna were hauled away, their place was flooded with hundreds of manoa hine, supported by our kane at our backs. And again, our people controlled the road, controlled our destiny, and continued to protect our aina. When we, manoa hine, took the road, we remembered the teachings of our kupuna. We sang our mele, chanted our oli, while some even danced our hula. We offered aloha and care to the police officers who struggled before us. We reminded them that we stood there for our children and their children. But most of all, we held on tightly to each other. We insisted that we would protect our lahui as fiercely as we would protect our mauna. We understood in that moment how the two were the same. The next morning, the number of kia'i who gathered at Pu'uhuluhulu in the Alahulu kupuna had tripled. Day by day, we continued to grow as 3,000 to 5,000 Kanaka and allies answered the call to kia'i our mauna. The wealth of our mana resounded across the Pai'aina. Meanwhile, the state cowered in its incompetence, spending more than $11 million in its threat to remove us from our ancestral lands. Today, our kia'i continue to govern the Alahulu kupuna with aloha aina and strict kapu aloha. Our people are rising like a mighty wave, and what we have accomplished cannot be cast aside. In fewer than 3 months, our movement brought thousands of people to the mauna physically and hundreds of thousands virtually. Most of these kia'i had never stood in the malu of Mauna a Wakea before. That's thousands of people who had never had an opportunity to develop an intimate pilina to one of our most sacred aina. Through our collective ea and our commitment to aloha aina, we brought these kanaka home. And in doing so, we have cultivated in our people an intimacy with a part of our aina we had been strategically estranged from. We have given Kanaka something back that was taken away from us. Kanaka living around the world are not just reconnecting to Mauna a Wakea, but also taking these lessons of aloha and pilina to their home communities. This movement and the sacrifice of our kupuna prepared us for such a strong and unrelenting commitment. Therefore, as we continue to grow, we will remember that it is this very intimacy of aloha aina that pulled islands out of the depth of the sea, that called upon the great core of our history to fight against a variety of oppressive forces, that mobilized Kanaka opposition to US imperialism and annexation. The intimacy of aloha aina carried 15,000 Native Hawaiians to march to the Iolani Palace in 1993 in recognition of 100 years of being a stolen kingdom. 25 years Later in 2018, Aloha Aina called another 20,000 of us to return to that march to celebrate the vibrancy of our resilience and resurgence. More recently, Aloha Aina called 8 Kanaka Maoli to chain ourselves to a cattle guard and later inspired 38 kupuna to face arrest. It's that same Aloha Aina that then resulted in upwards of 5,000 Kia'i joining us at any given time to protect our mountain. And it's putting that intimate Aloha Aina to action today that has resulted in similar uprisings and communities in Waimanalo, at Hunananiho, Kalailoa, and Kahuku, and will surely empower the continued rising of our Kia'ian Maui at Nawai'eha and Ka'ua'ula and Kauai at Hanapepe. The power of memory and remembering our past and the pilina that we have been reclaiming is still so very important to this movement, because our mo'olelo and kupuna teach us that it is our pilina to our aina and to each other that gives us the kuleana and mana to govern. We should celebrate the many ways our people are returning to an aloha aina that is not simply political, but also deeply intimate and emotional. I believe it is only a matter of time until the 30-meter telescope corporation packs up its bags and departs our beautiful home. And on that day, we will have succeeded in protecting our Mauna from this specific act of violence. But perhaps we should also remember that we are not simply standing in opposition to desecration. Rather, we are fearlessly committed to protecting our humanity and our ability to live, breathe, think, and act as our kupuna have for generations. What if protecting Aina is what makes us Kanaka in the first place? What if that is the wealth and lesson of our ancestors that we cannot afford to lose? Oh.
Thanks, Haoli. So we'll hear next from Noenoe Silva.
Aloha. As Haoli said, I've read this book several times, and each time, without fail, tears are brought to my eyes at several different points, and the text just as they did a few minutes ago as you were reading. For me, we're in a really exciting time in Hawaiian literary and political studies. This book represents or is part of the very start of literary analysis of Hawaiian language texts. So in previous eras, Hawaiian literature was treated as legend or myth or mined for information about Hawaiian language or culture, but not treated seriously as literature. Since the start of the MA program in Hawaiian language, there have been a few works treating our literature that have been written in Olelo, Hawaii, and Hawaiian. And the first work of Hawaiian language literature study, or I have a hard time saying literature criticism or lit crit because it doesn't feel appropriate. It's more of a celebration of us, struggling to understand what is actually in these mo'olelo, what are the lessons that the mo'olelo are teaching us. And I think that, since that first work written in English by Ku'aloha Ho'omanaba Nui, her book Voices of Fire, published by the same press, University of Minnesota Press, back in 2014, that's the way that, that we've been approaching our literature. So Haoli's book is the second book to really treat this literature. Her study of the language and the 4 different versions of the mo'olelo of Hi'iaka focuses on the nature of relationships of pilina and intimacy among people, among our deities and our aina. It teaches us a tremendous amount about how our recent and our ancient ancestors conceived of those intimate relationships. This book teaches us that our aina is always central, and in fact, there is no language in Hawaiian to express love that isn't also about aina. She thus links aloha to aina in a fresh way and reveals new dimensions of the term aloha aina for us to ponder and enjoy. One of the important parts of this is that although we know that before missionization, our ancestors had no thought of compulsory heterosexuality nor monogamy, you can just imagine maybe Kamehameha saying, what, I can't sleep with all of my wahine? What, I can't sleep with my boyfriend? What? That it just wouldn't have made sense. So Hailey's book elaborates these ideas based in the text, right? As well as her own theorizing. She elaborates these ideas and practices for us. Her examination of specific terminology and episodes in the mo'olelo show us how our ancestors thought, talked, sung, told stories, and wrote about Pilina. And so, though she engages with and expands the concepts of queer Indigenous studies, she beautifully illustrates how in Olelo Hawaii, and especially prior to Christianization, queer was never queer in Hawaiian thinking or practice. One of the crucial points that she makes in the book is how aloha aina is not only present in human pilina, but is inextricably linked to our political exercise of aloha aina, or the political aspects of aloha aina. So one of my many favorite passages in the book is this one, in which she honors what we accomplished in protecting Mauna Kea. And I was nervous there for a second that you were going to read this actual thing, but you didn't. Thank you. She writes, the power of memory and remembering our past and the pilina that we've been reclaiming is still so very important to this movement, because our mo'olelo and kupuna teach us that is our pilina to aina and to each other that gives us the kuleana and mana to govern. We should celebrate the many ways our people are returning to an aloha aina that is not simply political, but also deeply intimate and emotional. At the end quote. And so I think what you were saying in the pages that you wrote, that you just read, we did learn many lessons. But one of the ones I think that so many people walked away from that was so powerful for all of us was that we can govern ourselves. Not that we really had a doubt, but it was the practice of it and the success of it and the way that it's seemingly, I'm sure it wasn't complete, but seemingly the entire lahui pulled together, whether it was, donating things or just looking around and saying, oh, somebody's got to take care of the opala, or whatever it was. We could do that, Yeah. Okay, so to end, I'm honored and I'm full of joy today at celebrating this book, which not only represents a huge leap in Hawaiian literary and political studies and Hawaiian queer studies, although we got to figure out a way of talking about that without the word queer, and also signals this generational turn from analyzing what's been done to oppress our lahui to celebrating the abundance of knowledge, wisdom, and literature of our ancestors and of ourselves today. Mahalo.
This stunningly beautiful book about pilina and intimacy and aloha aina is transformative. It's a product of layers of intimacy. There is intimate scholarly knowledge of mo'olelo, a deep dive in Hailey's English terms. It's guided by a deep love for Hailey's lahui. If it does not transform us, it is not aloha, Hailey tells us. And she relishes the transformations one can learn from Mo'olelo and from extending this knowledge to political commitment. This book is also about intimacy and transformations in Heoli's life. As such, it reads like an invitation to make readers' own intimacies more prominent in our academic and political work. I also felt intimacy holding a book that I know will make a huge impact, that feels like history being made within its pages. Intimacy as a topic and a mode for thought and for life brings to the surface something deeply concrete, a regrounding, in Heoli's words, a theme I want to return to in a minute. In its honesty and its insistence on intimacy, this is one of the bravest books I've ever read. And it certainly is the bravest academic work I've ever read. Its arguments, while understandable on many levels, are not always approachable. And that's a good thing. And a brave thing for Heoli to insist on. Many intellectual discoveries are shown in this text, but none are given away. A note on language use at the beginning makes it clear that deep diving into Olelo is a prerequisite for fully following all the illustrations in Mo'olelo that Heoli ties together. In addition, this book is highly original, but gently refuses originality. As the Mo'olelo of Hi'iaka that Heoli gathers form and upena without need for an original version, so this book reties threads from past to present and future. It is brave in its aim to create a pu'uhonua for queers to see themselves reflected while all the time unqueering desire and pleasure, yielding to a time already envisioned when this particular pu'uhonua is no longer essential to uphold. All the many ways this intimacy reestablished at the center of a people, a movement, and an epistemology matters for Kanaka aspirations. And I'd leave that to Heoli, my fellow panelists, and others to talk to. It's not my kuleana. Instead, I'd like to briefly talk about why I will assign this book to prominent place in my next legal theory seminar. For among all else that it is a brilliant legal text. Heoli points out in numerous places that the occupying state's law and legality are central obstacles to Kanaka well-being, contributing to what she calls colonial sickness. Imported laws and Western law generally violently hold together the gendered hierarchy seen as heterosexism, heteropaternalism, and heteropatriarchy of settler colonial nationalism. This sickness can be exposed and eliminated. The defense of Mauna Awakea discloses law's contribution to, I quote, the insidious invisibility of settler colonialism, which repeats that the state is only following the law. The recovery of Aikane, Heoli writes, offers a first step into a world unmolested by toxic monogamy and heteropatriarchy as it moves beyond the legalistic imagination. Nonetheless, Heoli is not done with law. Western theorists accept that sexuality and violence lay at the origin of Western legalistic imaginations too. Freud argued that law emerges out of pure force that can distinguish murder from killing through an agreement of brothers about their access to women. Many modern ideas of law have also praised reason in the same breath as they denigrated savagery, ultimately making colonialism central to legal norms and law central to the educational violence and the sexual obsession of colonialism. Law is the primary story Westerners tell themselves about the requirements of social order, and it is praised internally for its abstraction. The essence of free government, wrote one American Supreme Court justice, is to be governed by those impersonal forces which we call law. Based in concepts such as the fungibility of property, including at times certain human beings or liberty, abstraction is celebrated for what it hides: the violence of colonialism, of patriarchy, of capitalist exploitation. Abstraction thus links legal ideas to subjectivity. Marx critically wrote that legal abstraction ultimately makes one an imaginary participant in an imaginary sovereignty filled with an unreal universality. This is the limit of Western law. In order to preserve this smokescreen of abstraction, law seeks to dominate other forms of order, including new legal ideas that might challenge or expose power. Robert Cover has argued that legal ideas spring forth with every new social interaction, a process that he calls jurisgenesis. Jurisgenesis, he writes, never exists in isolation from violence, but it also requires no state. The creation of legal meaning takes place always through an essentially cultural medium. An implication is that law is violent in the way that judges maintain abstraction by killing off competing legal ideas and ways of life. He writes, it is the multiplicity of law, the fecundity of the jurisgenerative principle that creates the problem to which the court and the state are the solution. Paoli implicitly and brilliantly responds in this book to both the problems of abstraction and the fragility of jurisgenesis. Aloha Aina is not a metaphor, she repeats and reinforces in several chapters. Rather than government by impersonal forces, Aloha Aina is sustained and constituted by real, genuine intimacy that transcends abstractions such as property or legal status such as marriage, kinship, gender, or species. Pilina to Aina is the standard by which we understand Pilina with each other, she argues. From this Pilina is generated politics, ethics, governance, and law in a new key. Thus, Paoli tells us, do not privilege deoccupation for resolving issues of gender, Pilina, sexuality, and other forms of gendered violence later. Instead, look to specific and diverse articulations of gender, relationality, and Pilina to guide nation building. The daily protocol on the Mauna made jurisdiction literal and powerful by speaking the law upon that Aina 3 times a day. This is jurisgenesis, revealed in Mo'olelo, based concretely, sensuously in the Pilina among the Akua, the Ali'i, and society. Pilina is at the center, and it repels abstraction and its violence. Paoli shows that her method of resisting translation, of not importing abstraction into the Mo'olelo, but following the experience and meaning of Pilina, is not just corrective, but generative. It is this generative, transformative capacity of intimacy and the study of Mo'olelo that has the power to remake thinking about law, about politics, and more without abstraction. Among so many other important contributions that will certainly prove this is a book of the ages, this is a book about law, one of the best I've read in many years.
Mahalo nui. Really appreciate being in this circle and having this opportunity to share and really ho'ohanohano this critically important work. Paoli, it like Noenoe moved me to tears when I first engaged it as your dissertation, which I consumed in a day as soon as I had access to it, and which has been really a key text, I think, in my own journey in continuing to think critically about Kanaka gender and sexuality, and also working with students who are taking that work so much further. And it was in that context where I first got to see that version of your mo'olelo with another student working on the oral histories of Kanaka queer individuals, and to see it again in this new version is, I'm just in awe of your ability to really get to the heart of what matters for us as a people. And it is pilino, it is relationships, it is our own approach to relationality, to being in relation, not only with one another, but with the Aina, with our ancestors, and not only over space, but over time. Actually, one of the more striking sentences of your book was your very first sentence on page 1, in Mo'olelo Hawaii, time is not a mime, which immediately brings one in to a much more expansive understanding of relationships in the wa, and as you reference, Kawa Mamua, Kawa Mohope, that time before, the time in front, time and back, time in now I'm getting messed up. The time before, the time and back, right? Language fails us, at least in translation. And thus, also on that note, your point about refusing translation and instead relying upon your rigorous paraphrase, I thought to be a really important move for those coming up who are trying to work in these spaces between, which is also what the WA is about, working between the Hawaiian Language Archive and the English speaking or other non-Hawaiian speaking scholarly world. And what does it take to carry those experiences over? Because it's not a question only for those working in the archives, but in community. And this has been one of our core concerns within anthropology, if I'll put that hat on. How do you carry over these experiences and try to convey that which is really impossible, even if perhaps it is in the same language? So the work you did here is truly inspiring on that count. And again, with the way that I try to bring that into the different fields, ethnic studies and anthropology, and my own practice of ethnography, of working within communities, doing interviews, immersing myself in the worlds and lives of Kanaka that I'm working with. Your call for us to remember that Aloha Aina really is an ethical practice rooted in Kuleana, which is about this accountability to the relationships, to the pilina. And that deeper exploration of Kuleana is one of the things that I wanted to touch upon as well, which is a discussion I've been quite immersed within in our anthropology department, as we've been doing quite a lot of soul searching to the extent that Kuleana really was the principle by which we have been trying to redefine what it means to do anthropology in Hawaii. And as you note, that Kuleana shifts depending on where you are in this upena, right? But from your, and for those who have the book or will get it, hopefully this is a call for many who will get it, this discussion that starts on page 125 and kind of carries on until 129, for me really offers not only an important way of thinking through how we read Kuleana in the Mo'olelo, Vi'iaka, but how we practice it as scholars. And on the top of 126, you start giving the broader definitions. People typically just say responsibility or maybe rights and responsibility, but you drawing upon the Fukui and Albert definition offer right, privilege, concern, and responsibility, but also noting those definitions around property, estate, title, claim, and ownership. They really come from this transformation of land ownership during the Hawaiian Kingdom, and offer a really important critique of that, so that people don't think that that's just something that was kind of always there. But more importantly, as you go to the next line and show that an example of usage linking Kuleana's pilina comes from one of the examples, Ohina komako Kuleana aole o ke kane. We are related through Hina, not through the husband. Thereby pointing to Kuleana as I think they talk about in their definition as this person through which relations are traced to more distant relatives, right? This is just so critical, right? And helps us to understand that these responsibilities, as you know, come from the relationships. It's the pilina that creates the Kuleana. And to then circle around and show how this gets expressed in the mo'olelo, as you do on the next page, talking about Hi'iaka reflecting on arduous task of retrieving their kane, talking about to be without pilina to the land is to be in a land without Kuleana. I found that really important and really moving, not only for us thinking about that journey, but for all of us scholars in lands that either are our own or more likely than not for anthropology are not. Right? And what does it mean to think about fostering the right kinds of relationship and your discussion of moving from kama'aina, from malihini to kama'aina, and not to just say that's an easy move or one that is applicable to everybody, I think is also a really critical point for people doing field work to consider. As well as the consequences for not honoring pilina and Kuleana that you kind of trace on 128. But the longer part I would like to read is from 129, when you're wrapping this section up and inspired by Honeneke Trask's writings, start to lay out for us this understanding of our interlocking authority and accountability to each other, Kuleana, is an increasingly important lesson to share with ourselves, settlers, and visitors as we continue the struggle to build solidarities, allyship, and pilina across multiple intersections of oppressions and privilege. Not understanding positionality and relationality in Hawaii creates huge problems for everyone with regard to Kuleana, representation, and decision-making. The governing institutions, malihini, to our people and run by settlers are making major decisions about development, education, and militarization confirms that there is an urgent need to more fully understand pilina and relationality to the people, places, and histories that surround us. So important, especially at this moment where our own university is going through its own reorienting around its strategic direction on a document called Our Kuleana, one that's been called out for, at the very minimum, being a little hypocritical as they continue to push forward with the development of Manoa Wakea. And again, your offering of experience there is so important too. I think it's really upon us all to take your words to heart and think about Kuleana and pilina in new ways. And I just, to wrap up, I'd also say that all of your personal offerings from your family, whether it was your dad and asking the kind of mahawai questions of young or others, and I think John might have mentioned and hinted toward this, really helped to serve as this invitation, which is not only of one to see within your own personal life or that of your family, but more importantly, and in the ways that the other authors who you cite poi poi, polumahie, bush paluhi, ihinui before you were doing was to break that fourth wall, as you talk about, to affirm and maintain intimacy between the writer and the public, and to bring them into relation with the book and the text. And so it's just such a wonderful opportunity for a new generation, as well as some older generations, to reestablish relationships, not only with you, but to the Aina that you're representing. And finally, anyone is going to kaimana, call it kapua.
Thank you, Ty. Haley, would you like to respond to?
Yeah, perhaps I can respond a bit. Well, I'm sure people have questions if they want to send them in through the Q&A. Man, piha ko'u pu'uwai me ka mahalo no o kou pakahi a pau. You know, when Nicole and I were talking about setting up this panel, and she asked me like, who would, because I said, you know, maybe someone could respond to the book, because Noenoe Silva told me once about how, I think Jairus did that for his, and it was this beautiful event. I was like, let's do that. And she asked me, who did I want to respond? And you three were like the top of my list. And I just suggested you three, thinking that, you know, two of you would say no, but all of you said yes. And I just feel so lucky, and just really, really mahalo, mahalo, mahalo. There are so many things you folks brought out of the text that, as a poet, I'm used to this, that the reader will find things that you intended, and also so many things that you didn't intend. And what's beautiful about that is that I get to learn from your reading, and I am transformed again from your reading of the text. And that's kind of the wild thing about having something that existed in your heart for so long now out in the world beyond your control. And so, you know, the way Noenoe, you talked about the foreignness of monogamy and the foreignness of, you know, heterosexuality, as like Kamehameha being like, what you mean? Like, what do you mean I can't act like this? What do you mean I can't be like this? Forces me to really think more about how monogamy and heterosexuality are quite literally as foreign to our people as the concept of land ownership. That the intricacy of that is so important to recognize, and these two things are happening at the same time, right? And then this other idea of the really personal and emotional connection to Aloha Aina, until Manoa, until I, you know, lived and slept in her malu, I could see it in the mo'olelo, but I couldn't feel it in myself fully, right? And it wasn't, for a lot of us, it wasn't until we were linked arms with other people, until we were waking up at 2 a.m. in the morning thinking that the cops were coming, that became realized, that became real in the body. And I think you're so right. One of the things that was most successful about that is that we got to see it happen. We got to feel it happen. And we looked around ourselves at all these institutions that we created, that we supported. And in all the times that the state of Hawaii says we need them, right? We need tourism to survive. You guys need us to survive. What if you were, you know, what if you were Russia or Japan or China or some other silly thing now? And we got to look around and say, look at actually all the ways we don't need you, and you're really just in the way. And one of the things that doesn't kind of happen facing forward in the text, because this is something that I started to be transformed around as the book was already, you know, going through all the processes and was kind of beyond my control, is how much our movement really does reflect so many abolitionist practices, right? Like, we built abolitionist institutions on the Mauna. We fed our people, we housed our people, we gave healthcare to our people, we educated our people, we provided safety for our people, all without the support of the settler state, all actually in resistance to the settler state. And in that work, although it wasn't perfect, we did not reproduce mechanisms of policing and violence that everyone seems to think we need in order to be safe. And I think that's one of the things, that's kind of the next step of, if we're going to take aloha aina seriously, and if anyone's going to take what I'm saying seriously about how aloha aina is really about how we aloha each other, then I think abolition's the next thing, because it's about all of us and not just some of us and some of our safety. John, I'm so excited you shared your mana'o, especially because, well, I have so much aloha and respect for you, but also because I'm not a legal scholar, and I'm always interested in how a text like this is going to be read by folks who actually understand the law and not just avoid and refuse it all the time. And the fact that you call this a book about the law, not a lot of people know this, but I was gonna go to law school. I finished at Stanford, and I was gonna go to law school because of how successful the law is at convincing you that this is the only avenue for change, right? That abstraction of justice, of governance, the impersonality of these systems. And I thought, like, in order to be a real activist, I had to study the law. And I was so lucky that my father knew that I would be so miserable that he slowly started introducing me to people like Ku'oloha, to people like Noelani, to people like Alohalani, and No'uravilla, in particular, introducing me to people in the English department, saying, look, just meet these people. I had no interest in English as a discipline, but look at what these people are doing with mo'olelo, and look at what you can do with mo'olelo. And at that point, I just decided, okay, I'm going to follow my passions, and it's not really going to have anything to say about the law or about governance or about politics. It's just going to be about these wonderful stories, and to kind of come full circle, and for me to be transformed through that work, and to see, of course, how all of this is deeply political, and instrumental in the way that we think about governance. But for someone like you to say that this has something to say to the law, I think isn't just a big deal to me. I think it's also something we should remind our students of, in all the different disciplines that we can push back on that singular primary story of the law, that story of abstraction, so that we may imagine and create otherwise. That I think is so important. It is not necessarily going to require all of us to be deeply unhappy and go to law school and go through that process. That there are other ways we can do this work, which just gives me joy. And I think the last thing I want to respond to is, I don't talk a lot actually about, when I talk about this work, I don't talk a lot about translation theory and translation practice. Every once in a while, I get a question about this like new method I'm working with, which really propped up because I just felt like the act of translating was doing the opposite of what I needed the book to do in the first place. And once Noenoe said, this is a great method, keep doing it, I was like, okay, cool, I don't have to fight with anyone. Noenoe said, so you go talk to her. But one of the really important things that Kawika, you spoke to, that I want to make sure people really understand when they read this text, is how fundamental translation has been in this process, and how our most basic understandings of our relationships to each other and our relationship to the land has been implemented through translation, right? And so when you look at the Hawaiian Language Dictionary, and I have so much appreciation for Puku'i and all the work that she's done, this book certainly would not have been possible, plus many other books would not have been possible without her incredible commitment to our language and to our people. But if you look up all the pilina that I talk about in this story, almost every single one of them is translated through the institution of marriage in the Hawaiian Language Dictionary, right? Kane and wahine become husband and wife. Kaikoeke becomes sibling-in-law. What else is there? There's all these different pilina that go through this institution of marriage. And in the same way, many of these pilina get retranslated through capitalism so that we can understand them, right? Like kuleana gets translated through this real estate relationship with land. And then everything that doesn't quite fit, that's just like a little too queer, gets turned into a sin, right? Aikane becomes sodomy, right? It didn't fit through the door of marriage. And so it has to become this like outrageous violence. And this is also happening in understanding that some of the first things that were legislated and policed were sexuality, right? When Hawaiians started writing laws, some of the first laws are on moi kolohe, and like moi aikane. And so getting people just to think even a little bit about translation, just to like poke a hole in that story, that translations are this neutral thing trying to help you communicate, poking a hole in that lie is, I think, really important, especially for people who really believe, right? Ika olelo no keola, ika olelo no kamake. And then I lied. There's one more thing I want to respond to, because Kawika, you talked about this, the breaking of the fourth wall, and the pilina, not just in the mo'olelo and not just within us who are reading the mo'olelo, but the pilina between the reader and the writer and those who are here and no longer. And this makes me think of, there's a really important passage in that part of the book that I first read in Noenoe's book. I think it's actually in both Aloha Betrayed and The Power of the Steel Tip Pen, which is great because I think it's one of the most beautiful things ever written across time. And this is in the 1860s when Kane Pu'u is writing. So Kapihenui's version of Hi'iaka is being published in Koku Kapaki Pika. And there are all these portions of the mo'olelo that have been cut out. Usually, these long chants that are just like taking up too much newspaper real estate. And Kane Pu'u, yes, it's also in Ku'aloha's book. And Kane Pu'u writes, you guys need to stop cutting out these mele and these oli, because at some point, Kapihenui's, I think it was grandmother or mother will pass away and nobody will know this important ka'au. And then he says, really beautifully, he says, the people of the 1870s, the people of the 1880s, the people of the 1890s, the people of the 1990s will want this stuff, will need this stuff. And Noenoe, you talk about how, reading this book, my book has brought tears to your eyes. There's nothing quite like that phrase, and reading it in your book for the first time that just sucked all the air out of me. And of course it was mahalo for him for saying that and believing that, but it was so much mahalo for you because you made it so that I knew that it existed. And so I think about that in the work that we do, and the real importance of writing this book, right? The Academy wants us to write books and like engage in scholarship in a particular way, and I could really care less about any of that. But someone needs to tell ourselves and our keiki, and 7 generations later, that we are doing this work for them, and that I am thinking about you right now as I sit alone reading this book or writing this book. And my greatest dream is that another queer Kanaka young person picks up this book and finds a passage, not something I said, but something Poi Poi said about Hi'iaka, and sees themselves fully for the first time and feels Hi'iaka reaching out to them through hundreds of years of silence. And that's really what I hope the book will. It's a big hope, but that's what I hope the book will do. And I can only hope that because your folks' work and the work of my other kumu in this world, it's done that. So thank you, Kawika, thank you, John, thank you, Noenoe, and thank you, Nicole, for letting me cry in front of all of our friends. I'm done.
Thank you, everyone. We would love to hear from our attendees in the audience. I'm sorry we can't see you. It's just this Zoom interface for webinars is really limiting. But if you have any thoughts or reflections, questions, please do feel free to put them in the chat. Oh, we've got some claps. I don't know. Can you all see the Q&A as well? all our panelists? Yes, okay. I have a question, Haoli. So thank you so much. Thank you for everything that you said and for this event, and to all of you as well for your thoughts. You know, you came to our 600 class, and I think I'm getting a little ahead of myself because I'm talking about like your new project or like some new stuff you've been thinking about, but you were talking about policing, and like I think about that a lot. And you mentioned abolition in this talk, and I'm thinking, you know, the way that translation, it plays such a kind of translation theory plays a big role in your work, and you know, how things like identity, sexuality, queerness, desire, you know, they just don't have exactly the same meaning when you're thinking about them through, or thinking about, you know, thinking about them through like Hawaiian genealogy or Hawaiian cosmology. There's just this productive tension there. And I'm wondering if you've thought at all about that in the context of abolition. So this is really just kind of a sort of open, maybe speculative question that I will throw at you. And I'm wondering how you think about abolition, what it represents, what it means, maybe as an extension from the work on embodiment and desire that you've already done, and kind of maybe moving into these new writings and reflections.
Oh, what a wonderful big question. So I guess I'll start with, you know, my own Manoa, my own thoughts about what abolition means is ever developing. I make sure to tell people, like, I'm definitely a baby in the abolition world, but I'm recognizing more and more how much my thinking has already been informed by really amazing foundational abolitionist scholars. So to me, and this is me, what I've learned about abolition is that abolition is a movement and a critique that is desiring to create a world in which we can live in genuine security and safety, and that we can live beyond this ridiculous story we've been told about law and order and justice, and crime and punishment. And when I learned more and more about that from folks like Ruth Wilson Gilmore or Angela Davis, and if I want to make the connection to like translation and language, the biggest thing that stands out is the creation of this idea of crime, right? And what has been deemed as criminal, what is acceptable harm, and what isn't, and how that language and that entire the product that is crime has been strategically created to cause further harm on communities of folks who look like us, right? The brown, the indigenous, the queer, for sure, the poor, and how all these different systems and structures that I'm already critiquing are helping to uphold that story anyway, right? The military, capitalism, patriarchy, all of this is holding up the building that is policing and prison and the prison industrial complex. And so my thinking, I will say, like, my thinking on this is really elementary and early, but what I would like to do, what I would like to think more critically about is there's a part of me that wants to do something in method very similar to what I did in this book. And that is go and look at mo'olelo that offer alternatives to this kind of model of policing in prisons. That would be really interesting and exciting work, because we also know that our kupuna did not live in a time without capital punishment, right? So there's like all this other stuff we need to talk about in terms of harm and state violence and stuff like that. So that's one thing. But the other thing that I think is really interesting to me is the success of abolition and primarily Black feminist scholars in that field is that they've done an incredible job of historicizing policing in prisons in the United States and drawing the connections from slave catchers to, you know, NYPD, right? Drawing the connections between these longstanding institutions. And there are some of us in Hawaii who can easily make those connections to see the harm of policing in Hawaii. But of course, that story, that particular mo'olelo doesn't resonate fully in Hawaii because our history of policing is connected but different and distinct, like as is anything else that's happened in Hawaii. So what I would really like to see and hopefully help to do is do hopefully an excellent history of policing in Hawaii, looking at the Citizens Guard and, you know, these institutions that were propped up to police Hawaiians who were fighting back in the overthrow and annexation. You know, like, what was our first police force? Why did it seem necessary? What is the language around its necessity? So that at least in Hawaii, we can have a more authentic and perhaps resonant conversation about this history, so that we can stop saying that stupid line of like, well, it's not like that here. Can we just like get over that hump a little bit? And then I think obviously the end goal of that, for now, from how I think about it now, is that this is still about Pilina. This is still about the world that we want to create and live in, and what kind of harm we are willing to take place in our names, and what we are going to consent to in that world. And so that's still about aloha aina. That's still about intimacy. That's still about who we see as worthy of life and ea, right? So I think this is something that Hawaiians, we need to talk more about.
Thanks, Haoli. We don't have any other questions in the chat. Natasha Sharma says that she's clapping and some heart emojis all over the place. But sorry folks, we disabled the ability for participants to chat with one another just as a way of sort of insulating from the potential of any Zoom bombing. But if you have questions for any of our panelists, please do post them in the chat, in the Q&A rather.
Can I ask a question of Kawika?
Yeah.
I was a little bit surprised. I hadn't thought that maybe, how this work might be affecting how you folks are thinking about anthropology and, the conversations that the department is having. So I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that, how, what specifically from this book is, prompting you to think about it a little differently, or what you
Sure. I mean, I would say because, I'd read the dissertation, I saw an earlier version of this, so I was already citing it, but in dissertation form. But yeah, the Christine Yano, my colleague there, when she was chair, really tried to underscore kuleana as a focus for our department to really try to get our faculty and students as well as staff to take seriously the responsibilities for being in place to community. And we started up an applied cultural anthropology master's program. Again, Chris took the lead on that and really kind of explicitly named it as kuleana anthropology, as that's the kind of anthropology that our applied program was going to do, I think, in a strong effort to distinguish it from the more instrumentalized forms of applied work that many of our faculty were concerned might come from this. Originally, I was a little bit not sure about that kind of term, just not only linguistically, it kind of comes off a bit odd, but also if people were actually going to take that seriously. But I ended up teaching that core course and spent quite a lot of time looking at different Kanaka writing on the subject and getting people to think really deeply about it rather than use it as just a kind of quick translation for responsibility. And the response I got from the students was that it, it was really transformative for them. Especially for the Hawaiian students, we don't have a lot, but we have some. They actually found a place for themselves now within the field that they hadn't previously imagined. And so because of that, I've really gone about with others, trying to emphasize a deeper engagement with that. We had a colloquium just a couple of weeks ago. Searching for Kuleana was the theme, and we had a whole Slack room that was set up for people to discuss it prior to and after that talk. And it went really well. I in very specific relation to the book, again, I thought that focus on relationality, again, which is about the book and Pilina, and the way that that's embedded in the meaning of Kuleana, was something that I was drawn to, and to see it kind of articulated the way that Heoli did was just a wonderful kind of affirmation that some of the things I had been thinking about were aligned with what's happening here in this text. I also know there's been different discussions around Kuleana for settlers versus Kanaka previously, with Noi and Candice, and to see also Heoli's thinking on this was also really important. There's one of the Olelo No'eau I've been using a lot in relation to this is e malama I ka olelo I kuleana e kipa mai ai, which kind of gets translated by Pukui as remember the invitation, for it gives you the privilege of coming here. But I think, again, with all Olelo No'eau, there's a lot of other ways of translating it, right? Heoli's point about rooting this understanding of Kuleana in the language, in the Olelo and the Mo'olelo, I think is another way of conceiving of that idea of Imalame ka Olelo. And then the point too made about invitations and knowing when there is one and when there is not one, I thought was also a nice way of returning to that Olelo No'eau, to not assume that the invitation is always there. Sometimes that Olelo is not given as an invitation. Sometimes it is given as something very different. It may not be perhaps palpably perceived as a refusal, but if one pays attention, malama Olelo, then maybe there's a different way of understanding that. So yeah, that's how at least the book here has helped me rethink, but it's been a department-wide kind of discussion we've been having.
Mahalo.
Heoli, we have two questions in the chat. One is about whether or not you plan on making an audiobook, and if you could please read it yourself.
I'm just going to respond to this real quick. I wish I had the time to make an audiobook. And I love that people ask that. And I know it comes from a place of, I don't want anyone else reading my book out loud to our audiences, but making an audiobook takes years and thousands of hours. And I would have to leave my job to do that. So I don't see that happening anytime, probably almost ever. And I'm really sorry to say that, but that's probably the truth. Yeah.
There's another question on abolition. So
okay.
If you could see it.
Yeah, I can read it aloud.
Okay.
Yeah. Mahalo nui for this meditation on how abolition opens up possibilities for remembering our intimacies. Really heartened by the abolitionist directions your project is taking, especially with the myth that HPD is kingdom police. And how, sorry, that wasn't in there, but that was me. And how even discussions of abolition in Hawaii mostly use sources from Turtle Island to apply here when there's need to attend to material conditions of policing and prisons here in relation. I'm wondering if you could please speak more about how you are thinking through how the imprisonment of Queen Liliuokalani and her defense team could inform abolition today, and how your chapter on Kapu and Kanawai could inform abolition in Hawaii. Wow, great question. And it's no surprise that this question is from Ari, who was a student in my class last semester and constantly pushing us to approach our abolitionist horizons. I learned a lot from Ari last semester, so thanks for being here, Ari. Okay, how I'm thinking through the imprisonment of Queen Liliuokalani. Yeah, I mean, I think there's someone else who's already done a bit of this thinking. I don't think they've published on it, but I did hear them present on this a bit, and that is Kalaniopua Young gave I was in a workshop with Kalaniopua probably almost a year ago now, run by Empowering Pacific Island Communities on abolition, and it was a bunch of organizers and activists, you know, mostly across Turtle Island and Hawaii, but indigenous Pacific organizers. And we were talking about how to bridge abolition into our communities, because especially in Hawaii, there's this big resistance, this idea of HPD as kingdom police, which couldn't, even in my limited understanding of the history, couldn't be further from the truth, but we won't get into that right now. But one of the things that Kalaniopua Young has talked about is both the relationship between Liliu being imprisoned, but also even just the US militarized and police support for the overthrow and annexation, that these are all policing issues that are directly related to our ongoing occupation in Hawaii. When you look at what holds the peace, what holds the order in the provisional government, you're looking at policing. And so in that way, you know, those of us who are anti-overthrow and anti-annexation, there's a bit of, like, it should be anti-policing in that narrative. But I also think we run the risk if we just, and I don't think you're suggesting this, Ari, but if we just cite these specific examples of like Liliuokalani being imprisoned, or other high profile ali'i being imprisoned at the time of the overthrow, or, you know, the Kamamakakawa and their imprisonment, we run the risk of simplifying the issue of policing, imprisonment, and abolition to, as it's this like exceptional few problem. Like, let's pay attention because they did this thing to our queen. And I really want to be careful in the way that we tell that story. Because yes, Liliuokalani was imprisoned in her own palace. Yes, that was an incredible violence against her and against the Hawaiian kingdom. That is not the same thing that is happening right now in our prisons in Hawaii. There is not, you know, people bringing well-made food and stories, and they're not playing piano in their prison cells. You know, there's this different experience that's obviously related to the way prisons end up in Hawaii. But I want us to be really careful when we try to make this story more relevant to our people. Let us not erase and forget the folks who are enduring this harm right now, because there are so many ways the system makes those people who are our family members invisible. And I would hate to eclipse their story using the aloha we all have for our ali'i wahine. Yeah, and then this idea of, you know, kapu and kanawai, what I'm really trying to do in the book is push back on this idea that the law is the only way we can relate to each other, that the law is the only thing that can hold up a society, not just because I think it's so, but because there are examples of it being so. And kapu and kanawai, I think when we push back on the way that they're appropriated and mistranslated, you know, as kanawai being law, which I think is such a violent reduction of what kanawai actually are. If you look at the mo'olelo, or you look at what was happening on the ala hulukupuna, I think it just opens up a space. If you're ready to topple something as foundational to society as law, then everything's up for grabs and everything can be renegotiated. So I hopefully that's where those ideas will go, or maybe they'll go to better places, but that's where I see them now.
Well, we're at, and my phone is going off, I'm so sorry. we're at time. Oops.
Did she leave us?
No, I'm here. I'm sorry. I was just turning it off. It's so funny that that happened because in 600, we just had a seminar on how to deal with technical difficulties. And, you know, my flip phone just did that for us to close this out. Well, thank you so much, Hale. It was really wonderful to hear you today, and also to our panelists, John, Noenoe, and Ty, for being here, and also reading selections of your book in different voices. That was really wonderful to hear. And also thanks for all of the people who came to be in this space with us, and for the questions that you shared. The talk will be available online, and through the poli-sci social media, through our poli-sci social media, I'll find out where we can, where it will be posted, and sort of notify everyone. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, folks. Mahalo.